And I am so thrilled to have you on the Faster Way to Fat Loss podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, how does one become an investigative journalist in the health and wellness field? Take me all the way back to the beginning. How did you get your start? Why did you get your start?
Well, it's really glamorous, really. You just have to get really sick,
Always.
and be sick from childhood, and then not know what's causing the issue, and have a mother that's compassionate enough to try to, do everything to try to help you, and then still be in this situation. So, like, I was a child that was struggling with their health chronically. Even as a teenager, when I started getting blood tests, what's wrong with me? Showing up with Lyme disease, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr, Ross River fever, glandular fever, chronic boils on my body, and the worst part of everything, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers could relate to, was the chronic fatigue. So bad that by the time I started just through school, it was so hard for me just to get up and go to school and then to be able to finish my exams. And I worked so hard. I was so ambitious, and it was a struggle. And that then in later years, once I then did a degree in communications with a double major in media production and journalism. And then while I was doing humanitarian work, seeing things all around the world when it came to global suffering and poverty, starvation, trafficking, I started to then, use that same analytical mind of researching world problems to health. And that then started opening this up that, wow, what if I've been lied to about what's happening here? And what if there are toxins or certain things that are causing this illness for me? So I became an investigator on my own health, and that changed the trajectory of my life. It changed my marriage once I then went on to become married, and now I'm a father of two young, beautiful boys. I then realized how important health was for my wife as she went through depression and anxiety, was clinically diagnosed with both and on medication for both, chronically fatigued, chronically in pain, and then finding herself in a situation where I'm feeling like my life is going to be ruined, and my wife's life, where our lives are going to be ruined if we don't work out what's going on. So that's how I became an investigative journalist.
Wow.
Really the personal side.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I think many people in the wellness industry, myself included, can relate with having a health issue, having some, pain when it came to health and wellness. I personally was on blood pressure medication when I was a teenager and had to go through my own journey for multiple reasons that our listeners have heard in the past. But we met at a conference fairly recently, and I immediately was intrigued by your line of work because you
Mm.
have an extensive background in the docu-series channel. So tell us just a little bit about some of the documentary series that you've worked on, and then we're gonna dive into one in particular.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So I did a lot with autoimmune disease. So I had autoimmune secrets, autoimmune answers, and then that same premise then led to neurodegenerative disease, dementia, Alzheimer's. And we had cases that we document of people reversing these conditions. And we saw it in data and clinical studies. And then I would see it even like when you get somebody, like one example was a medical doctor who herself was doing clinical trials on Alzheimer's when she realized that she couldn't remember the same three words she was getting her patients to try to remember. And she realizes I'm as clinically impaired as my patients, but then realizing she had no solutions, and she went on the same path as what I and others had to go on to discover how to reverse that. And yes, she completely reversed her dementia and went back to practicing as a functional medicine doctor. That was in connection with Dr. Dale Bredesen, and that's Dr. Kathleen Tube. So we saw examples like this. I made series like depression, anxiety, and dementia secrets, seeing the link between depression and anxiety and dementia, because you have a 5 times higher risk of having Alzheimer's or dementia if you have depression, and a similar case is true with anxiety. So these are precursors. It also indicates that a toxic component, environmental component to neurodegenerative disease and cognitive decline and any kind of mood disorder. So films on these subject areas, natural medicine secrets, and then the recent ones have all been actually looking at the prospect, or the what I believe is absolutely true, the use of biological weapons and how they're affecting us, and the intentional use of these things. And so we deal with highly sensitive, highly controversial topics like COVID, vaccinations, COVID vaccines, what's showing up in the government databases, how people are being injured, and how people can reverse these injuries, and how people can look to educate themselves and defend their rights that they have. they've been all the key areas I focused on. I felt like it was like a calling from God to do that because I wouldn't have done that if I didn't. My wife begs me often, "Hey, Jonathan, are you sure you're not just doing this because you feel like, you just want to put your hand up for a fight because you just want to be that guy? Are you sure you're doing it for the right reasons? Have you prayed about it?" And then I'd call mentors. I'd obviously pray first and ask for signs and then get strong indicators, strong signs that, no, this is what you're supposed to do. And so that's kind of been a lot of my work over the last few years.
Wow, and we should have a full podcast series that follows your docuseries
Oh,
journey,
thank you.
because we have so many clients and women in the faster way community who have struggled with autoimmune diseases, and dementia is absolutely a topic that I'd love to dive in with you on in the future. I actually started researching intermittent fasting as it related to Alzheimer's and dementia because my grandma struggled with dementia and Alzheimer's. And that was one of the first reasons that I heard about intermittent fasting and even saw the research related to intermittent fasting. This was years ago before I started my program, The Faster Way to Fat Loss. But I'm sure we could spend hours and hours discussing those topics. I
Yeah.
shared with you that in the Faster Way to Fat Loss community, we recently launched a faith and fitness round of our program. We launched here very recently and had a few thousand people join as a new client. And then we offered some of the resources to our VIP members as well. We currently have about 50,000 active clients, and many of whom said, I want to work on my spiritual health in addition to my physical health. I consider wellness to be very holistic. And so it's been really exciting to see the response from our community in regard to the faith and fitness round. And you said to me, listen, I did a Bible health secrets documentary. And so I thought, gosh, let's get you on the podcast. Let's talk about the research and what you found through that particular docuseries.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. So we kind of saved that one for last. That's the one that I didn't mention. It was a fascinating journey to understand that you would look at the Bible as kind of potentially an archaic book that maybe would have some good life lessons, but not necessarily an education manual for health and how to discern pillars of health and key areas that people would miss. But it was exactly that way. And so the direct evidence for that, Amanda, is there are 5 blue zones in the world. So it includes the Okinawans in Japan and Sardinia and various places in the world, but there is only one of them that's in America, which is a blue zone. What's a blue zone? So Dan Buettner was commissioned by the National Geographic to do this study. And if you fell into this category, it meant that you were a group of people that were basically living to 100 years and beyond. But key there, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to live to 100 years. But people start thinking differently when they have children and grandchildren. And then you realize, I don't want this to end. And that's how God wants us to be, because we're designed to never want a relationship to end. That's why the Bible talks so much about eternal life. We shouldn't like wish for our death or just kind of say, well, everyone has to die some way and go and eat our French fries and fast food every day. And so what was happening with these studies, that people were living to these ages, but they were doing it without aches and pains, without memory loss. And that was what really categorized the centenarian. And the only group that was in America that was doing this was a Christian group that were abiding by 8 pillars of health that they would adhere to, that they would say, well, this is a biblical standard. And they were living to these old ages. And one of them, who was in my film, was a doctor named Dr. Ellsworth Wareham, so prolific that Dr. Oz found him to be someone that he had to see practice, because he was aged 95 when he retired as an active surgeon. He was a surgeon's assistant, which actually means he was actively performing surgeries, which he did from age 75 to 95. And he died at 104, and I'd reached out to him to have him in a new film, and he'd finally declined interviews at 104. And so he was then declining interviews. Later that year, his daughter reported that he had died, but he again showed no signs of cognitive decline, even until his death, and no signs of pain. So these were signs that people could live incredibly healthy lives using biblical standards. So I just found that tremendously encouraging. The Bible is not an archaic book. It has so much relevance. And I really do believe that anyone that is a believer that believes our mission in life is to lead people to Christ and to be in relationship with Christ, what a better way than to show people how to get out of pain, because that is a very attractive thing that you can offer somebody, and then that can lead somebody to a relationship with Jesus.
And this is a very interesting conversation, whether someone listening does have a relationship with God or not. I think that anyone can learn from this conversation. What were some
Exactly.
of the principles that this surgeon you spoke about were following to live past 100, to live to 104, but not only live, but thrive?
Absolutely. So, like, this acronym that they would use is New Start. So New Start, 2 words together, New, N-E. So N for nutrition, E for exercise. So it was surprising how contributive exercise was to preventing Alzheimer's and dementia. You kind of think it was primarily, just a nutrition thing, but the big drop-offs would happen with exercise when people would have these early onset or these Alzheimer's or dementia signs and symptoms. But exercise could have a tremendous effect at reversing these, or working in collaboration with other therapies to put these at bay. The other thing that was contributive was retirement, which is surprising. So when people would retire, they would stop using their minds creatively. So if they were retiring, they would have to do something that would keep their minds engaged. And that was where the Bible study came in, because when you think about it, if you're intelligently engaging with the scriptures, you're actually really using your mind, and you're thinking about a concept, you're thinking about how it relates to another verse. And so you'll see a lot of these people that, instead of basically feeling like, oh, now it's time to just live a hedonistic life and just be pleasure seeking, just play, I don't know, do nothing, sit around, watch TV, they were engaging their minds with the scriptures again. So that was just an area of keeping their minds engaged. So I've kind of tied that into exercise, but it's a bit bigger than that. So nutrition, exercise, and I'll go into more in what specifically they did diet wise, because it is really key for that. And all the blue zones held certain nutritional aspects in common. W, new, it was for water. So water intake, obviously very important, but again, it's something that gets skipped a lot, and it's something that people are often not hydrated enough. I can see that you're hydrating yourself well, man, so
Yes,
you're
I
leading
am.
by example. While I bring it up. S for, sunlight. Again, something that's overlooked, something that's demonized. We're being led to be afraid of the sun. We can be afraid of the sun simply because we're not having good nutrition, and so our skin will actually basically decay and, get malignant kinds of, issues and cancer in the sun. But when we're off all those horrible deep fried foods using all the rancid oils, our skin is not going to have that kind of effect that we would naturally have, and we can actually live in the sun, which we were designed to do. So T for start, so S-T, T for temperance. So, which is this concept of like doing things in balance and having the ability to restrain yourself, which could also be, I mean, the Bible talks a lot about sexual restraint, that just because you can do it doesn't mean that it's right or that it's good for you. And so sex in the right context is something that's beautiful and abundant. But a lot of people are struggling because of all these areas we indulge in pleasures that we think are good, but then we find that it's hurting us. So that could be with food. And again, so I'm not advocating that people, like, sex is a beautiful aspect of life. My wife having a trauma background, we had to really understand how to unlock that so that she could be able to enjoy that beautiful God-given gift. And so we understand the beauty of that. But temperance in all areas of life, a very powerful aspect. A for air, the breathing, the ability to intake, and then R for rest. So one of the things that was interesting about that this blue zone, they would have a seventh, in this case, it was a seventh day, a day of the week that was a rest day where they would do no work. And if you look at the studies that came, or the historical data that came out of something like the French Revolution, where they instituted national atheism. And in order to do that, they had to actually attack some of the standards, which were the 7-day week actually points towards creation. So they instituted a 10-day week, and it was a numerologist that determined that the mental asylums had doubled in number, that said this 10-day week doesn't work for people. It actually leads to more insanity. And Stalin actually did a 5-day week, and similar observations were made there. So our bodies actually work with a weekly day of rest. And it's interesting that the fourth commandment out of the 10 commandments says to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. In it you shall do no work. So to give yourself permission that it's okay not to do any work. I'm a child of God and I'm precious. I don't have to prove myself, was a tremendous aspect of that. And then finally, T was trust in God, a relationship with God, and having a relationship where you can trust in God because you discern attributes in God that are tender, fatherly, and that you don't feel a threat in the presence of God. You feel love and you feel connection. And so you have a deep level of trust. This actually is tremendously helpful with health. So that was just a few of the key pillars there.
So interesting. I'm going to read back through. I was taking notes
Yeah.
as you were talking. Nutrition. We'll do a bit of a deep dive on the nutrition component.
Yeah.
Exercise,
That'd be great.
water, sun. And these are all very important components of success in the faster way.
Mm.
Temperance, air, rest, and trust in God. I again want to
Yeah.
say, I am very well aware that we have listeners who are saying, gosh, Amanda, this maybe doesn't apply to me because I don't believe that the Bible is God's word. I don't believe that the Bible is true. I don't believe in God at all. However, I think that you should stick with us on this podcast interview
Mhm.
because there are nuggets here that might change your life as well. And so, whether or not you come from a Christian background or a Catholic background, or you say, I'm an atheist, I'm agnostic, stick with us. You've made it this far. Let's, hear Jonathan out and kind of, talk through some of these different elements. So, the people who are living over 100 years, in many cases, are abiding by this biblical wellness. And so, dive into nutrition. I'm not 100% sure if you and I are going to necessarily agree on
I love
nutrition
that.
here, which is fine.
Isn't that
It's
good
totally
though?
fine. So
It's
tell
so
me what you
great.
found.
Sure, and I'll absolutely show how we'll find some crossover here that I think you'll find really powerful. Okay, so what was interesting about this study and all the National Geographic study was that all the groups that lived longest had the lowest animal intake. So it wasn't even like a black and white necessarily, like you've got to be vegan. It was just simply that like the most any of these blue zones had meat was once or twice a week.
Okay.
Think about that compared to I mean, if you had it 3 times a day, you're talking about 21 times a week, 7 days if you're eating 3 meals, 21 times versus 1 or 2 times, and typically it was more like 1 or 2 times a month. And then if people were going back to, if you looked at that biblically, you couldn't really afford to slaughter an animal every day or to have that meat. It was more of a novelty versus something that people would do all the time. The civilizations that would do it all the time were like basically like the Egyptians, and we can do autopsies on those mummies, and they've been done. The Egyptians died of all the diseases. The royalty Egyptians, I'm talking about the mummies, they died of all the same diseases we die of today. Like Queen Hatshepsut died of cancer. That was Moses' surrogate mother. She died of cancer. I mean, that is important information. Diabetes, heart disease, they all had these signs, whereas the peasants, they didn't have those diseases. So they were living on more plant-based diets. Royalty was high in animal intake. So I'm not saying no animal intake, I'm saying moderation. Okay, so and then the Loma Linda, like people like Ellsworth Wareham were completely vegetarian or even vegans. So it's really interesting to know that. And studies have been done, even on those groups, they showed half the rates of Alzheimer's. I mean, just Loma Linda, California, a study showing half the rates of Alzheimer's among those there on that vegetarian diet versus the surrounding population. And then you look at, where did they get the evidence for this? Well, they looked at basically Eden. So if you really think about it, so well, I would challenge you with this, Amanda. Was there any death in the Garden of Eden before the fall of Adam and Eve?
No,
So what did they eat?
plants and fruits.
So what was God's original
Yeah,
plan?
fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And I think I totally hear you on that, but then things did change. So I think that was, that particular season. So it's always a conversation of kind of past, immediate, or present, and then future. I said, I'm not sure if we're going to agree just
I
because
like it.
I personally do focus on plants. So I would say I'm plant focused. There's
Exactly.
vegetables in every one of my meals. I have red meat probably once a week, maybe once every other week. Just depends. I have a lot of fish. I live in Florida. I have access to fresh fish. I do have a lot of chicken, and currently I have a lot of protein shakes because I'm lifting heavy. So, I mean,
There you go.
we probably do agree on more, but there's so much out there right now that's just much so pushing certain agendas. You got people that say you should have bacon for breakfast and steak for lunch and dinner and never have a single banana. And then you got people who say you should only ever have plants. I think there's probably a solution somewhere in the middle, and bioindividuality is so important. Maybe the types of foods that you thrive off of being from Australia might be different than what someone from Calgary, Canada, so I don't know. I mean, I think but I
Yeah,
but
exactly.
but I don't wanna derail the conversation, so I wanna
No,
hear
I like
more.
it. It's great, it's great. No, I love it. Look, it is great, and, like, you'll notice, like, look at Amanda and I discussing this. Notice how neither of us are, like, feeling like a need to defend our position.
Yep.
If Amanda invited me over for dinner tonight, I would eat anything she served me, and I would enjoy it, and I would thank you so much. It is a faith-based study and approach to look at how did God do things, but it's not a religious approach to these things. It's like, there's freedom, God gave us freedom, and I'm just looking at data, and so one of the things I think is interesting, Amanda, is that when Dan Buettner was doing his study to look at the longest living groups of people in the world, if the high animal intake diets were in any way going to perform well in these later years in life, they would show up. There would be some examples of people that were living something a little bit more to carnivore. And then people try to reference like the nomadic tribes, like the Tanzanians, the Maasai, or the Turkanans, and of which I work a lot with those groups, actually, funny enough. They sadly don't die of cancer as much, but they do have very high rates of disease still. And people that advocate for paleo, they say, well, look at our Paleolithic ancestors. We came from cavemen. Even those cavemen skeletons, you'd say, well, look at this missing link between apes and humans. And I'd say, well, show me the ones that are real, because I could show you all the fakes that were debunked in court, in legislative court. These are jawbones typically of like orangutans mixed with human skulls, and they have been debunked. They're actually an attempt to make people think that they're less and that God made us not separate and special as distinct from the animals, but that we are purely just animals. And so those agendas are kind of confused. But even if it were true, how long did the cavemen live for? And I'd show you it was around 30 years old. So why would you want to go back to that? So there's interesting things there. And then go back to, for example, when was then meat permitted? So then God said, well, like, for example, there was 2 animals of each kind going onto the ark, but there was 7 animals of the clean animals, cows, chickens, and people don't like think about that. So they needed those clean animals for sacrifices and for which I could explain more, because I believe that if you study that more, God was meeting people. To sacrifice animals was something that God had to communicate through at that time because of their beliefs, but not something that God actually required or desired. And Psalm 40 says, I have not desired or required burnt offerings or sacrifices. These are Old Testament verses all the way through. It's like, it's not my requirement, but I will meet you through this. Anyway, they were permitted then to do that, but then how long did they live for? Like the times of Adam, it says how long he lived for. You know the rough time periods that they lived for, right, Amanda? Like, wasn't just 50 years, or
Right.
it was
Hundreds. Yeah, Methuselah was up to
Methuselah?
930
Yeah,
some years. Was that who it was? Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So now when did the lifespan drop?
Mhm.
After the flood, and the permission was given to eat animals. Permission and do this, I want you to do this, and permission are 2 different things. And then you've got cases like Daniel that wouldn't eat the king's meat, and so then he's naturally have like, I'm not saying that he was like, "I'm vegan, I don't." He was saying, "I can't eat the meat because 'cause it's been sacrificed to idols." So that was his reason, but then he was eating pulses, vegetables, and he scored as 10 times more wise than his competitors and more healthy, and that was what got him and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the guard that was overseeing them all off the hook, because his head would have been on the plate if they were unhealthy in any way. And there's even cases like there's a lion in the 1950s that was completely vegetarian. Little Tyke, you can look him up. He would not eat meat. Even if they put a drop of blood in the milk, he wouldn't eat it. And so even animals that you would understand, well, this is a carnivorous animal, it would not survive if it was not on meat. Well, actually, it lived to 9 years old, which is the median age, right on the median age of what a lion would live, completely vegetarian, self-imposed because its mother murdered all its siblings. It was in captivity, and the mother threw it up against the cage, and the people pulled it out of the cage, and it survived. So it was actually injured as well, and it still lived a great and healthy life, but it would not eat meat because it associated that with death. Even these animals have the ability to understand, like, do we have to take so much life? Some of my friends that are eating, like, I ate 15 chicken hearts today. I'm like, well, what if you could just, have them as pets? Like, what if we just played with those chickens and you could eat these artichokes and they'd be great for you anyway. So
I think my biggest takeaway from what you shared is that we are able to have an intelligent conversation about this. Neither of us is using the fight or flight side of our brain or, getting argumentative. I love to educate myself. I love to see the data. I love to hear the research. And I think that it's worth hearing your expertise based on the Bible Health Secrets docu-series that you completed because that's informed a lot of your current habits and decisions about your lifestyle. So, nutrition is, of course, a
yeah,
very important component of overall longevity. And at the Faster Way to Fat Loss, it is our primary focus. We do have a plant focus in regard to having lots of vegetables. We have micronutrients from fruits and vegetables. We recently did a smoothie reset where we had lots and lots of amazing gut healing smoothies. And then we also look to exercise. So, exercise is the second component. You mentioned physical exercise in addition to exercising the brain, the mind. So, really quickly, let's dive into that. For the doctor, for example, who you interviewed, who was a surgeon until 95 and lived until 104, what type of exercise? Was it a strength training? Was it walking? What did that look like?
yeah. They were huge advocates of walking, which is really interesting, and I even looked at studies where they would reverse Parkinson's gait, where people are walking like a tin man and they end up, like, being able to dance like they were able to dance in their 30s, and how did they make this huge transition? And they would do it through conscious walking, so they would be very mindful of the pathway that they're walking, and so they taught me to understand how basically the brain, these neurological pathways that are in our brain, they're actually like a path that has grown over with weeds, and so the path is there, but they can't see the path, and so these neurological pathways can't flow through these channels anymore, just in our brain, simply because we're not actually associating our movement with our mind, and so they would be very conscious of every movement they were taking, consciously walking instead of kind of you're walking, you're thinking about paying bills and something that stressed you out, but you're not actually thinking about what you're doing. So they would do things like conscious walking and taking in that environment. And so these things go together. When you see like creation, everything around you as being this beautiful depiction of God's love for you, you can be out in nature, breathing in the air, getting all that beautiful oxygen that's coming from the nature around you. And then you're taking in that sunlight. So you're getting everything at once and you're getting that exercise. Yes, it's great to go to a gym, but you're not going to get some of the benefits if you get out in nature, even get your shirt off, wear something that you can wear outside that allows you to get as much sunlight in. But they would do things like this, but I still am a believer in strength training and things like this. I don't know if whether Dr. Ellsworth Wareham was doing that or not, but I know that definitely a lot of them were doing like long walks and they would incorporate that daily. When there was a clinic that Dr. Neil Nedley would have for depression and anxiety, and they would institute this New Start program, when people would come in there with depression, anxiety, depending on how much depression, anxiety they'd have to do like even hours of exercise, intensive exercise per day, because it was working in place of some of those drugs that would try to somehow replicate this, but the body could produce that if it was under that pressure of exercise. So I would say that like, what you do, Amanda, is amazing, and I feel like people should absolutely just follow what you're doing with the strength training and getting the body active because it does absolutely work, and it is great to focus on having full body strength. It is fantastic.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I'll tell you, we did an Empower 45 series last year, and as part of the series, we required a 20-minute walk with a loved one daily. We did gratitude daily. We continued to focus on whole food nutrition and tracking our macros daily and then also drinking water. So many of the things that you are sharing are very aligned with the programming. I believe that every single person listening to this podcast should be taking a daily walk. 20
Mm,
minutes minimum. Every single person listening
yeah,
to this podcast should be taking a walk daily. You live in the Midwest, it's cold outside, take a walk. You live in Florida, it gets hot and humid, take a walk. Whatever the case may be, every single person listening should be taking a walk because A, take the walk without the phone, put the phone down, keep the phone at home. It's
yes,
it's
you got it.
so wonderful to be looking at God's creation, getting the vitamin D, breathing in fresh air. Every single day, my family takes a walk together. I leave the phone at home. maybe that's the biggest takeaway of this podcast is, to be willing to pause from the stress and anxiety of the day because so many of these different items are being checked off the list with a simple walk. You've got the exercise component, bring some water with you. You're getting the sun, you have the air. It can be a bit of a rest or a pause, when you're walking slowly with a loved one and you're taking in creation. So walking can solve so many problems. It's probably the most underrated, form of exercise out there, Jonathan, and I'm sure
So
you would
true.
agree. So new start,
I
nutrition, exercise, water, sun, temperance, air, rest, and trust in God. I love that so much. I know that we are coming down on our time here. So just quickly, can you talk with me about the T cell study that we had mentioned prior to the interview starting, the T cell study?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that one up. I mean, this one is so profound. There is nothing that has helped my life more and addictive behaviors, including the ability or the miracle of actually God helping heal my heart from like addictive behaviors, period, including things like pornography in my own life, than understanding God's character. Like I had never found anything that could actually turn my heart from desiring things that I knew I should not desire that were not good for me. Like for example, that after even decades of understanding the issues with these things, abstaining from them, but still finding myself in moments of extreme pressure and stress, finding myself want to find relief in something like pornography. So anyway, so this is a precursor for saying, okay, to this T cell count, I'll show you what made a difference in my life and helped heal me from certain things like this so that I could just close the door to this chapter of my life that was like a painful pursuit of something that was a desire for comfort, that was actually a craving for God and to know God as God is, as a tender father and not as a executioner. And so I didn't realize that in my mind I'd seen God as an executioner. This has a tremendous impact on people's health. Remember, judgment as well as a precursor to death. So, for example, if you are standing before God and you feel that God could assess you and find that you're not good enough for Him and say, "Well, I don't want you, and I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to get rid of you." This thought in people's mind has been so deeply hidden that people would say, "Oh, I don't really have that," but yet you'd find yourself entertained by so many violent films that would have these themes in them, even if they're not considered a violent film. But if you see a character get punished by death and then you feel satisfied by it, it's showing an image of God that you have that is requiring death instead of the redemption of the victim or the redemption of the wrongdoer. And so this study was conducted, and Dr. Daniel Amen shared this with me from Beautiful Minds, and he was doing a lot of research with mental health. And this particular study was done on HIV/AIDS patients, and it was three groups of people, and they were trying to measure the T cell counts of each of these groups. And it was an atheist group, a Christian group that believed in a vengeful God, and a Christian group that believed in a benevolent, merciful God. And surprisingly, the group that performed the lowest this may not be surprising for some people, but for a Christian group, it would be surprising to know that the lowest performing group was a Christian that believed in a vengeful God. That was the lowest performing T cell count, which meant their immune system was the lowest. And it makes sense because if you are under threat, you cannot escape that image you have of God. It's there when you go to sleep at night. It's there when you wake up in the morning. It's that looming threat over you. Do it or die. And imagining if you were a parent sitting over your child when they're trying to get something done, they're trying to create some kind of painting. Your daughter came in before, showed us a beautiful thing that she was drawing. And if you were sitting over her saying like, if you fail at this, I'm going to beat you, she'd be drawing out, she'd be panicking, she'd be crying, she'd rip up the paper, she'd be self-sabotaging in every way. This is what's happening with people's health, and this study was indicating this. The second group was the atheist group. They fell in the middle. So they didn't have as high T cell count as the other group, and they had higher T cell count than those that believed in a vengeful God. And so sometimes people are running from the wrong image of God. So someone's listening and say, "Well, I don't believe in God." And I say, "Well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I probably don't believe in that God either." And it's not serving you. So it makes sense that you didn't believe in God for the time because that image was not one that would help you. It didn't support you, but until there's a better understanding. And so the group that, okay, obviously by disqualification, the group that fell the highest was those that believe in a benevolent, merciful God, had the highest T cell count, highest immune systems. And I would say the finding of the study was really that these people were less in fight, flight, or freeze. They had a sense that everything was gonna be okay. They had a belief that even if things went wrong in this life, that God would take care of them and that their soul was loved, nurtured, deeply adored, and that's how I started to feel in relationship with God. Once I uprooted all the false images I had of God, I stopped my interest of things like that were wrong, like pornography that I knew were affecting me, even though it wasn't necessarily something that it wasn't even necessarily habitual, but it was something that it was still alluring in times of extreme stress or pressure, and I'd find myself obsessing over these thoughts, but then it was replaced by a nurturing, loving God, and you'll find that in the book of Genesis where Adam's now is at war with God. He believes God is a threat to him. "I heard your voice in the garden, I was afraid, so I went and hid myself." Now God is a threat to him, and if you think that you've escaped this, it's in your epigenetic memory. We are part of the human race, and we have been at war with God without realizing, and because we have believed wrong things about God. Why are you afraid of God, Adam? Don't you understand that if you have a problem, you run to God, not from him? Why do you run to him? Because he's not a threat to you, because he will never harm you, because he would never judge, never want to take your life, never choose to take your life. And the things in the Bible that seem like God is a threat are actually the things that show consequence. And they're natural consequences. They're not God imposing them. It's natural law. If I smoke cigarettes, my lungs will get cancer. Not God will give me cancer because I smoke cigarettes. And so it was a reframing of my view of life that then gave me that freedom. And that's what that study really indicated. And I believe that if anyone taps into this, it will promote a better state of health in your life. And these studies are very clear on that.
Mm. Jonathan, this has been extremely valuable and interesting, and we truly appreciate your time and your expertise. As I mentioned, we could probably do a whole podcast series that follows your docu-series journey. Tell us where we can find you.
Sure. No, I appreciate you so much. So healthsecret.com is my company. Well of Life is actually a nutritional supplement company, welloflife.com. And I'm on TikTok and social platforms. You can look up my name, and our videos through those platforms are getting tens of millions of views. That's True Health Secrets on TikTok, but you could just look up my name and then jonathanotto.tv, and you can see some of my work there. So yeah, a few places you can find my work. But the cool thing about our series as well is that they're free. So you can just watch them. You can put your name and email and watch them free, and they're very entertaining and educational and inspirational. People need stories that motivate them. They need reminders that it's possible. A lot of us don't really believe that we can get better, so we don't do anything differently. And so that's what my films are designed to do, give you science that backs up those things that we're teaching, but also case studies. And one of the great case studies is actually my sister-in-law. She had the high stage of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. She had that since age 9. She's my age. She's like, I'm 37. She was able to reverse both those conditions in 4 weeks on like basically the diet I was talking about before.
Mm.
You can follow that work through goodbyelupus.com. That is Dr. Brooke Goldner's work. It was a raw food diet
Mm.
or plant-based. These results speak for themselves. And so I was shocked myself. I went through the lab work live with the medical doctor, going through a lab work showing that she, didn't show up with these symptoms anymore. So our films are all about kind of highlighting these case studies, showing the science of how it backs them up and how people can try them out, even if it's for short periods of time. So like even if you were I'm going to just do plant-based for a little bit, or I'm going to try to incorporate more plant foods in my diet. It's just kind of, we meet people where they're at. It's not a dogma, but you could be on any diet and you could still implement all these different things, or you could try various things, and we educate on all these in our films.
Amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. We truly appreciate it, and we'll be connecting with you online.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I appreciate you doing this and I love your work. You're doing incredible work, and everyone that follows you is super fortunate to have found you, Amanda. Truly, you care about people and you're leading by example, and so I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.